In the previous video, we saw how the Middle Byzantine Army was organized into the provincial themes and the imperial tagmata, and how it was equipped to fight its adversaries, namely the Muslims and the Bulgars. However, the catastrophic Battle of Manzikert resulted in huge loss of lands for the empire in Anatolia, and consequently weakened the theme system. Despite the reforms that were enacted as early as during the reign of Alexios I in the late 11th century, and later during the Paleologi era, the Byzantine army would never be able to reclaim its past glory and would remain a shadow of itself until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Welcome to our video on the late Byzantine army. We use many sources for research and inspiration, and nothing inspired us more to make this series than the documentary called Byzantium, Crusaders and Venice from the sponsors of today's video and the documentary platform of our choice, Magellan TV. This documentary explains the intersection of Eastern Roman, Venetian and Crusader interests, why they so often were opposing each other due to a variety of political, cultural and religious reasons, and it was essential for our research of this series on Byzantine history. Byzantium, Crusaders and Venice is part of the series called Empire Builders, which talks about various empires throughout history, including Rome, Britain, Spain and many more, and we recommend it to all history buffs. You can join us and watch this documentary by using our link in the description. However, Magellan TV has much more than that. There are more than 3,000 documentaries waiting for you, and hundreds of them are on the history of various eras. New ones are added weekly, and all of them are in 4K and available on most devices, including phones and PCs. Magellan TV has a kind and exclusive offer for our viewers that we highly recommend you take advantage of. Click the link in the description to get a 1-month free trial and watch hundreds of history documentaries anytime, anywhere. The most known of the reforms introduced under the rule of Alexios I Komnenos was called the Pronier System. The Pronier were grants of the revenue of the land and the labor services the inhabitants of the district owed to the state. Fiscal rights were bestowed to an individual by the emperor, and they were generally claims on taxes burdening the peasants and immovable property such as mills, mines and docks. The Pronier, as the one receiving the grant was called, appropriated the fiscal rights only over properties which the Byzantine state itself owned. And since revenue sources varied from region to region, so too did the forms of the grants. Like their predecessors, the theme soldiers of the Middle Byzantine era, the Pronier holders characterized the military of their age. They might not have been the more numerous type of soldiers, nor the most important, but they are what represents the late Byzantine army better. The Proniers were most often natives of the empire, though there were foreigners whose remuneration was tied to the land. Yet unlike the thematic soldiers, their employer was the central government, not the local administration. Thus he was not a provincial soldier, but one of the central army, and was consequently quite often an absentee landlord. This should not create a misconception that they were full-time military men, as they were reservists that were called upon when needed, and otherwise his taxes would be used to raise troops elsewhere. The wealthiest were also accompanied by small retinues, the largest not exceeding 80 men, while the norm was probably a mere handful. These men were called iki, or kinsmen, and sometimes were supplemented by household mercenaries. They were expected to fight as heavy cavalrymen, while the infantry was provided by smallholders who had been granted land to cultivate, though even in their case it wouldn't have been necessary to do the farming work themselves, and they could instead lease the land to peasants. The Pronier system has a lot of similarities with Western feudalism, yet there are substantial differences. Unlike the fiefs, the Pronier could only be granted by the emperor, and thus couldn't be subdivided. Furthermore, the land was technically still owned by the state, and was not the personal property of the Pronier, who had only been granted the fiscal rights to it. Thus, unlike serfs, the pariki were free men, able to buy and sell the property or move from their village. The Proniers, whether poor or rich, were still soldiers, and therefore had to be organized into units. Unfortunately, late Byzantine authors are inconsistent and use archaic terminology. Yet there is one term that is tightly connected to the Pronier soldiers, the Alachia. Commanded by the Alahator, who was the equivalent of a dux or the modern-day major, these units probably consisted of 300 to 500 men. In the Chronicle of Morea, General Constantine Palaiologos had 18 Alachia for a total of 6,000 Proniers, which would mean around 330 men in each. Theoretically speaking, they could be subdivided into smaller units of 100, 50 or 10 men, and going up in scale, several of them could be merged to form taxis, syntaxes, lokoi and tagmata. The latter shouldn't be confused with the imperial tagmata of the earlier centuries. Byzantine sources also mention some different types of Alachia, if we could possibly call them that. These are the Vasilica, imperial, the Mechala, great, and the Authentica. The first type most probably refers to units that were part of the imperial guards, while the Great Alachia are likely to have been large contingents, the size of a modern-day brigade. It's likely those included every soldier of the province, whether cavalry or infantry, garrisons or reserves, who were referred to as Megalo-Alahite. They first appeared in the 1280s under the Palaiologi, and lasted roughly a century, as the provinces on which they were based were gradually conquered by the Ottomans and the Serbs. From then on, the organization of forces in the Byzantine army seems to be entirely ad hoc. Of the famous guard regiments we saw in the previous episode, only the Varangian Guard survived the death of Alexios. To them was added a regiment of Vathariote, who mainly performed police duties. These were men of Hungarian and Cuman origin that during the reign of the Emperor John III Vatatzes had settled the upper valley of the Vardar River, hence the name. Although viewed as foreigners in their early days, they were gradually Hellenized until they stopped being considered mercenaries and became citizens of the empire. The Imperial Guard also included 2 Alachia of Paramone, one being infantry and the other cavalry, as well as a unit of foot archers, the Mortati, who were of mixed Greco-Turkish origin or Christianized Turks. And there was also the mace-armed bodyguard of Marines, clad in their distinctive breastplate adorned with white lions, the Sakonis. Finally, Nikephoros Gregoras mentions that the Emperor John VI Kantakouzenos had as private guard an Alachion of 500 Catalans, led by Juan Palatra. It is from a contemporary of John Kantakouzenos, Theodore Palaiologos' work, called Instructions, that we learn more about the armor used at the time. Theodore's work constitutes the top military manual of the late Byzantine era, and although it uses Western terminology, it isn't hard to translate it to the Byzantine equivalents. The typical Byzantine cavalryman of the 14th century would furnish a pourpoint, aubergeon and gaucheret, the courier and some gambeson, chapelle de fer, sword or glaive, greaves, cuisse with the lance and shield. The pourpoint probably refers to a padded surcoat, similar to those that existed in the Middle East. Under the surcoat was the aubergeon or coat of mail, which was worn in great variety, either short or long sleeved, knee or waist long, and with attached or separate mittens. Some late Byzantine soldiers, however, preferred to wear cuirasses on top or in place of the hauberks. These were made out of metallic or hardened leather lamellae, resembling those of Turco-Mongolic origin. The gaucheret was a kind of neck guard, either mail or plate. Contemporary Byzantine art depicts various kinds of neck guards, rigid or semi-rigid, made of iron lamellae or hardened leather. However, the Curie Theodore mentions, which was a leather garment worn under the hauberk, is not mentioned nor seen in Byzantine sources. Finally, the most common type of helmet used during the late Byzantine era was the chapelle de fer, literally the iron hat. Its shape ranged from conical to roundish, and its brim was either flat and wide or narrow and sloping downwards. As with previous helmet designs, it wasn't unusual for it to have attached mail avant-tails or be worn over a mail hood. The defensive equipment of the typical cavalryman was completed with a large shield of an elongated triangular design, often called the Norman shield. On the other hand, it is not a secret that the infantry branch constituted the Achilles heel of the late Byzantine armies. It was separated into heavy and light infantry that fought as spearmen and archers respectively. The spearmen, the so-called contarati, were armed with a long spear, a sword, and a large Western-type almond-shaped shield. Their armour was usually leather or chainmail, with the first ranks often wearing extra protection. In battle, they deployed in formations 4 ranks deep, and unlike their predecessors, they had no archers to support them as part of the same unit. The archers themselves were divided into 2 subcategories. On one hand, there were well-equipped and disciplined units, able to even defend themselves in melee combat. However, these troops were limited in numbers. Much larger and common was the second type, that consisted of unarmoured archers that, besides their bow, were only equipped with a dagger or knife. From the end of the 13th century, these men weren't even professional soldiers, but instead peasants that were called to fulfill their duties towards the state. During the 14th century, a large percentage of Byzantine archers abandoned the traditional composite bow for the Western crossbow, which the Byzantines called zakhra. These men constituted a separate force and were commanded by the Stratopithahis Tonsangratoron. Famed archers were also many of the Cretans who served in the Byzantine army of that period with great distinction, and whom Ducas describes as the empire's most faithful subjects. Characteristic of their bravery and loyalty is the story of the Cretans that fought during the siege of Constantinople in 1453. It is possible that these men were part of a guard unit, the existence of which was recorded in 1422. But whether guardsmen or not, the Cretans showed such great tenacity in their task of defending 3 towers near the Blakine Palace that the Ottomans allowed them to leave the city unmolested. While archers and crossbowmen constituted the vast majority of missile troops of the time, by the late 14th century, a new technology was spreading in the Balkans: gunpowder artillery, followed by handguns. Despite the fact that the Byzantines knew of the existence of firearms by 1392 at the latest, the virtually non-existent economic sources of the empire meant that it was impossible for them to participate in this late medieval arms race, and it's unlikely they possessed their own until 1422, when, according to Calcocondyles, cannons were used to defend the walls of Constantinople from the Ottoman besiegers. These guns were probably acquired from Venice or Genoa. Any army cannons Byzantium obtained after 1422 were given as gifts from various European states, and so far there is no evidence that the Byzantines ever manufactured their own. The only known record of a cannon founder in the area of Constantinople is that of the Hungarian Orban, who had offered his services to the Byzantines in 1452, 1 year before the Ottomans would capture the city. But the Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos could not afford his high salary demands, nor could he supply the materials necessary for the gun's construction. Thus Orban approached the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II and was given abundant funds and materials to create a giant gun that would demolish the city's walls. Ironically, the Hungarian engineer would die during the siege by one of his own creations when a cannon exploded, claiming the lives of both him and the crew. The Byzantines also used artillery during the siege of 1453, however their guns were not as numerous as the Ottomans, and contemporary historians that were also eyewitnesses inform us that their discharge shook the walls and did more damage to them than the enemy. Leonard of Chios adds that because of a shortage of both powder and projectiles, the guns could not be fired very often, but when they did, they caused a great number of casualties in the Turkish camp. From 2 instances during the siege of 1453, we can see that the Byzantines not only lacked artillery, but also lacked comprehensive knowledge regarding its deployment and usage. This inability to understand how artillery was supposed to operate seems to have created frictions amongst the defenders, as Leonard of Chios informs us that Lucas Notaras denied Giovanni Giustiniani's request to use the city's cannons to defend his section of the wall. The second incident revolves around an unlucky anonymous gunner that served the largest cannon the Byzantines used. According to Chalcondyles, when the gun exploded, which was a common occurrence at the time, the gunner was accused of having received bribes from the Turks. Smaller firearms, for which the Byzantines had several names, like moliphofolon, lead thrower, skopita, or tufax, might not have even been adopted by the Byzantines at all. The only evidence we have is the suspicious account of Ducas, who in 1462 wrote that the Byzantines during the siege of 1453 shot lead balls which were propelled by powder, 5 and 10 at a time, and as small as Pontic walnuts. However, it is known that among the Italian defenders of Constantinople there were some equipped with handguns. The limited artillery and the unimpressive number of defenders that had gathered to defend Constantinople in 1453 was in fact a small miracle accomplished through the hard labour of Constantine Palaiologos. Despite his efforts, however, the small, ill-trained and ill-equipped Byzantine army couldn't defend against the might of the Ottoman besiegers. The conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans signalled the end of the empire, and consequently the end of the imperial army as a constitution that had existed for over 1,000 years. However, we still have a few more episodes on the Byzantine army on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description, to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.